All right. Well, tonight we're going to just continue on in our early stages of our study of narratives and just the how those work and what specifically we need to focus on as we consider biblical stories and how God communicates His truth through a story. And as we've talked about, there are some different uh, aspects of narratives, of stories that we need to pay attention to. And so we'll focus on that in a few weeks. But we want to consider as we approach any book of the Bible, we need to understand the book as a whole, whether it is a narrative or whether it is prophecy or an epistle. And so the first few steps that we take as we approach a narrative book of Scripture is basically going to be the same or very similar to what we do when we're looking at epistles that we've studied. So today I want to focus our time on the background context of the book. Again, this was our second step in the exegetical process after reading and observing the book as a whole, which we looked at in our last session together, and the one before, is now the background context of the book. And again, to remind us, the background context of the book, really, we call that the setting of the book. That is, what is it that prompted the author to write? Who is the author? Who are the recipients? Who's the original audience? What was the situation in which he wrote? And so last time we looked at a few of those elements. We talked about the author. He's obviously part of the background context. Now, again, in narratives, authors don't reveal themselves typically. They don't, like in an epistle where it would say Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ to the church in Rome or Ephesus. But with narratives, we don't have that kind of introduction because they're stories. And so they typically just start out as a story. And so many times we don't know specifically who the author might be, but there are comments usually made by the author at different points in his book. We're going to look at an example actually today from the Gospel of John and how we might be able to identify the author from the text itself. And it's the same with the recipients. Usually the original audience is not always clear, but some cases it is. We looked at Luke, I think, last time, and Luke indicates specifically who he was writing to, a man named Theophilus. And so sometimes we do get that information, but oftentimes we just have to look for certain details about perhaps the original audience. And again, we're gonna see some things from the Gospel of John as an example. Historical context, that is, when was the book written? Do we have any clues or information from the book that might indicate when it was written? Any statements or events there? Last time we looked at the book of Kings as an example of trying to identify potentially when the book was written. And as I mentioned to you last time, we looked at 2 Kings 25, and we're looking at the book of Kings, and recognized that the last event mentioned in the book was the release of King Jehoiachin. And that was during the exile, toward the end of the exile, when that took place. And the latest date that we determined from the book of Kings, as you read the book and study it, would probably be the return of the Jews to Jerusalem, because no mention of that is made in the book. And certainly we would expect there to be some mention of it if it had already taken place in the time of the writing of the book. Because, for example, in 2 Chronicles, we do see that event mentioned in the book of Chronicles. And so it appears that the return of the Jews to Jerusalem had not yet happened at the time of the writing of the book of Kings. And so we can estimate probably that was written, the book of Kings was probably written during the latter part of the Babylonian exile. Again, if you remember, the Babylonian exile began the first wave from King Nebuchadnezzar, where he took Daniel and other Jews back to Babylon, was in 605 BC. And then, of course, the Lord said that would be 70-year captivity. So they weren't released until about 70 years later. I think something like 538 BC or somewhere in there. So the book of Kings is written toward the end of that time period, most likely. All right. Because again, these books never have a date. You usually don't have a date stamped on them. Okay, I'm the author and this is when I'm writing the book. We don't usually have that. Normally it's just, it's a narrative. So just the story begins and the focus is on the story. So that's with Kings. Now with Chronicles, as I mentioned, is another example of trying to identify when a book could be written. The earliest date would be the last event mentioned in the book, and that in Second Chronicles was the decree of Cyrus to release the Jews from Babylon. So that'd be the earliest date that the book is written, because that's the last event mentioned in the book. What is the latest date? Well, that one's a little harder to determine. The book was translated and put into the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was done around 200 BC. So we know that it couldn't have been written after that. What is the likely date? Well, we looked at this last time, and this is where we ended. And I think it's, I'm going to take a look again here. Actually, let's do this. And as we consider this particular book, and I'm bringing up Chronicles and Kings because I'm going to come back to these two books later in the course, so I want to introduce them here. But if we look at Chronicles, again, 2 Chronicles 36 mentions the earliest possible date of the writing of the book is when Cyrus, notice at the very end, first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. And if you remember the book of Daniel, chapter 6, the hand on the wall, that event, that very night was when the Persians came into Babylon and defeated them in a night, and they took over. And Cyrus was the first king or the king that ruled over Persia at that time. And he was the one that released the Jews to go back to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And so that was the last event mentioned in the book of Chronicles. Therefore, that would have been the earliest it could have been written. And as I said, the latest it could have been written could be even sometime after that. What is the most likely time that it was written? Well, it's interesting to note, if we go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 3, there's this mention of Jeconiah, who's the son of Jehoiakim. Jeconiah is another name for Jehoiachin, who was a king of Judah. And so here a genealogy is mentioned early on in Chronicles, and Jeconiah is mentioned. His sons are mentioned. Shealtiel was his son, who, by the way, his Shealtiel's son was Zerubbabel, who was he was the governor that went back with the Jews to Jerusalem from Babylon. We find his name in Haggai, Zechariah, and Ezra, and he was a prominent individual in the return of the Jews back to Jerusalem. He became the governor of Judah, Jerusalem in particular. His sons are mentioned here. And if you follow this list, it goes down 8 generations from Jeconiah. And that's the last person mentioned, is the sons of Elioenai here. And so he's the last generation from Jeconiah. That's, I think, 8, if I counted right here. And so we could estimate, if it's 25 years or so with each generation, that's about 200 years. So it's very likely this book was written probably about 200 years after Jeconiah, which would put the writing of the book around maybe 400 BC, something like that. So because, again, that's the last person mentioned in the line of Jeconiah. So that's probably a good indicator of when the author was alive and when he was writing the book. And so this is just an example then of how we might be able to, here I have a little description of what I just said. how we might be able to identify the time period in which a book was written. All right. Oftentimes there may be clues within the book. We can at least know the earliest it could have been written from the last event mentioned in the book. But sometimes you can even determine the time of the writing of the book based upon other clues given within the book. And so who would have thought, right, if you studied the genealogy of this particular book, and you find buried in this genealogy in First Chronicles 3 some clues that tell us when the book is written. But that's often the case, is typically books will have some clues that we can find with careful study. All right, not every book. Some books it's a mystery. Job, for example, well, we're not sure exactly when that book was written. Probably in the time of the patriarchs, maybe around the time that Moses wrote Genesis, but we don't know for sure. But there are some indications within the book. It talks about, there's no mention of kings there or judges. It seems to be in the time of the patriarchs, the way that Job behaves, which would be the days of Abraham. But it could have been written much later after that. But some of the Hebrew words are very old within that book, and so that's why scholars think it was written earlier. But often it's difficult to identify exactly when a particular book may have been written. But as I said, many times there are clues that are given to us within the book. So here's just a couple examples from both Kings and Chronicles. These two books cover similar events, right? They cover the time period of the kings of both Israel and Judah. Chronicles was written, as we see, a little bit after Kings. Kings, as I mentioned, was probably written somewhere around 550 to 560 BC, toward the end of the exile. Chronicles was written sometime later, maybe around 400 BC. Okay, so because of that, then we would recognize that the audiences are going to be different. Okay, who might be the audience of the book of Kings? Well, if we think about who was around, what people of God were around at the time that this was written, well, this would have been most likely the people of Judah in the exile. Okay, this is the most likely audience. Chronicles, however, the audience would be the people of Judah. Again, remember, the northern tribes who were scattered by Assyria had never come back together. So the primary location of the people of God in these days was in Judah, the southern kingdom. So this would have been the people of Judah, in the days of Malachi, perhaps somewhere around there. Okay, different audience. Again, it is the people of Judah most likely, but 150 years later, after the book of Kings. And so this begins to prompt us to think about, well, why was the book of Chronicles written? We already have the book of Kings. We already have a book that details events that took place in the time of the kings of Israel and Judah. And then all of a sudden, there's another book written that talks about the same kind of events, the book of Chronicles. You have to ask, well, why was that done? Why would he write another book that describes a history that the people probably would have already known from the book of Kings? That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. Well, we're going to actually talk about that a little bit later when we consider the purpose of a book. Just because a book describes the same kinds of events does not mean that that book has the same purpose. Again, we think about the Gospels, right? We have how many Gospels? 4, correct? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Well, we think about it. Why were there 4 written? And actually, you really have to think about that with the Gospel of John. We had the first 3. They were written, probably within 10 years of each other, something like that. And we know, Scripture talks about on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so it makes sense. There would be 2 or 3 Gospels related to the life of Christ that would testify about him. But then you have this Gospel of John come along, 30 years later. Why did he write that? When we already had 3 other Gospels that were circulating that described the events of the life of Christ. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's just, I'm bringing this up to remind us that each book has a purpose. And even if similar events are being described in that book compared to another book of the Bible, that doesn't mean they have the same purpose, the same reason that they were written. And Kings and Chronicles is a really a key example of that, which I'll again we'll talk about the details of that in a little bit. But that's from I wanted to use those 2 examples just to show that if you do a careful study of a book, oftentimes you will find clues within the book that help you understand around the time period that it was written. That's not the case all of the time, but it is the case many times. Okay, any questions about that? I'm sort of reviewing where we were left off a couple of weeks ago, but I wanted to start there just to, again, go over those 2 examples. But any questions about that? Kings or Chronicles, identifying the time when a book may have been written? There's another consideration as well that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about the historical background, the background context of a book. And that is this: when identifying the historical context of a narrative in Scripture, it's important to recognize there's 2 aspects, 2 historical contexts that we need to keep in mind. There's the historical context of the author, that is the time in which he wrote the book. And we just looked at an example of that from Kings and Chronicles. But then there's the historical context of the story in the book. Okay, those aren't always the same. For example, we just looked at Kings and Chronicles. The book of Kings, as I mentioned, was written toward the end of the exile, but it covers events all the way from the latter days of David, King David, and his reign ended about 970 BC. And the book starts toward the end of his reign and goes all the way through, as we just mentioned, 560 BC, the reign of Jehoiachin. So the book of Kings goes from David to Jehoiachin, also known as Jeconiah in the book of Chronicles, right? So that spans about 400 years. Now, the book of Chronicles covers similar events. It goes from basically the early days of King David to Cyrus. All right, and that was be around 970 BC to about 538 BC. So it goes a little further. Those are the events being described in the book. So when you look at the book of Kings and you look at the book of Chronicles, the events within the book cover a similar time period. But these 2 books were written at a different time. Make sense? Again, Book of Kings covers events, as I just said, from about 970 to 560 or so BC, but it was written around maybe 550 to 560 BC. But the book of Chronicles covers almost the same period. It goes a little bit later in time, but it was written probably, as I just mentioned, based on that genealogy from Jeconiah to 8 generations, was probably written about 400 BC. Why does this matter? Who cares? What's the big deal? Okay, it just isn't this just for historians? They care about dates and numbers, but well, this is why it matters. Because again, notice both books cover about the same period of time, but they are written at a very different time. As I said, they're written probably at least 150 years apart. So the situation, the circumstances, the audience, they're different between these two books. Even though they address similar events, and in some cases, when you read the two books, it's almost like they're exactly the same description of some of the stories, but they are written at a different point in time for a different reason to a different audience. That's very important to understand. And so it is helpful if we have some indication about what time period the book is written, so we might better understand the situation, the audience, the culture at the time of writing. But we also need to understand, okay, the book of Kings was written by somebody who lived toward the end of that book. So they perhaps were very familiar with certain events from the latter days of those kings. But Chronicles was written by somebody, some believe it was Ezra, somebody 150 years after the last events of the book. So this is somebody writing a history much later than when the events of that history took place. Again, he had a particular purpose, a purpose that was different than when the book of Kings was written, as we'll talk about a little later. But when we're studying a narrative, we want to try to understand what's the historical context of the author, that is the time which the book was written. What is the historical context of the story? That is, what is the time period of the events recorded in that book? And they're not always the same. Okay? So keep that in mind as we look at the historical context of narratives. Now, when we look at epistles, those books are, written at the time of, the author, and it's near term. It's written at the time the events took place, the occasion took place. But some books of the Bible could be written much, much later than the events being described in the book. And that is the case, as I said here, for Chronicles. It's also the case for the Gospel of John, we're going to study in a moment. All right. Questions on that? You guys tracking with me so far? Does it make sense? Okay. Just want to make sure that's clear. So this is looking again at that we're studying the background context. We've talked about the author, recipient. Now we're looking at the historical context, and many times those things are connected together. What's the next thing we want to look at? Well, it's the same as when we considered epistles, and that is the social context. That is, as you're reading the narrative, identify what names or people groups are mentioned in the book. What do we know about them from Scripture? So you'll see various names that are given. So like, for example, we just saw Jeconiah. Who is that guy? What do we know about him? And oftentimes you can look at different books to get information about particular people mentioned in the book. Just like we saw when we studied Philemon together, if you remember, there were names mentioned in that letter, and we were able to, from those names, get a lot of information about where the Philemon lived and when that book was written. So looking up the different people mentioned can be very helpful when we're studying a book. Same in narratives. It's okay, who's mentioned here? What do we know about that person? There's some information given in the book, but often we can look outside of the book to determine that. So when you're studying the background context of a book, you want to note names that are mentioned in the book. You also want to note places that are mentioned in the book. That is the geographical context. Very important. As we see places, locations mentioned, the original audience would probably have been very familiar with what those places were, why they're important, what is significant about them. But for us who live much, much later than the original audience, the locations mentioned may not be that obvious to us. One, we may not know where that location is, but two, we may not know much about that location. And oftentimes it's important. So when we talk about Nineveh, we're studying the book of Jonah, which is a narrative. Nineveh's mentioned. Well, what's significant about Nineveh? What do we know about the people of Nineveh? Why would God send Jonah to them? Is Nineveh in Israel? Who lives in Nineveh? Understanding that location and what is known about it is very helpful to understanding what's going on in the story. Okay, so we want to do our best to determine that. And oftentimes, again, we can look at different books of the Bible to get information. And then here's a place where oftentimes Bible encyclopedias can also be a great resource for us. They've done studies both within the Bible and looked at archaeology and other things outside the Bible that gives some helpful information. That online resource that can be very helpful is International, I think, is it Standard? Bible Encyclopedia. Does that sound right? Josh, are you familiar with this one? ISBE.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's an older work, but let me make sure I got the web. Oh, sorry, internationalstandardbible.com is the website. I found this to be, at least for an online resource, very helpful. It's an older work, but it's got a lot of great information. In fact, why don't we just take a minute and go there? Let me, just in case some of you are not. All right, can you see on your screen the website open here? Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay. Well, maybe, sorry, let's go here. Here we go. Okay, here's the website, International Standard Bible. Again, notice it's an old work published in the early 1900s, but it's got a lot of helpful information. So if we wanted to say, okay, well, Nineveh, studying Jonah, what do we know about Nineveh? So I just look up Nineveh here. And notice there's lots of places, lots of people mentioned, topics mentioned. Here's Nineveh. Okay. And then here's some information that they give about Nineveh. And they'll mention information that gathered from outside resources, but also from within the scripture. So here's a lot of helpful details about that from this particular website, internationalstandardbible.com is the website. Okay, so again, this is not scripture, so it's not a perfect resource. It's not, there's perhaps some things that aren't completely accurate here, but overall, I found it to be very helpful as a resource for looking up. Again, you can see different places, different people. So if you're studying the Gospel of John and you're looking at Cana, say the wedding at Cana, and you're wondering, okay, what do we know about Cana? Did we know anything? Here, notice Cana of Galilee. And so some information is given there. Okay, so that's one resource to consider online. I think, to me, the best resource when it comes to, if you can get your hands on it, biblical encyclopedia, is the Zondervan, I think, Bible Encyclopedia. I found it's a more updated resource. It's like, I think, 4 or 5 volumes, and it's got a lot of helpful material there. So, but that's not online, unfortunately. It's something you'd have to get access to either through Bible software or have the books themselves. But there is a good online resource for this. So a Bible encyclopedia can be a very helpful tool in our study, particularly when we're looking at the geographical context and places that are mentioned. But first, the best thing to do when you're studying a geographical context is first, again, look at books of the Bible to get that information. All right. It's always helpful to look first to scripture, because that is an infallible, inerrant source. There are no errors or mistakes in the Bible. We can be fully confident of the information we find there. So that's the first place to look. But then a Bible encyclopedia can be a good supplement to that as well. Okay. So that's for geographical context. Even the social context, the Bible encyclopedia will mention different people as well. For example, if we're looking at, I think I mentioned Evil Merodach. He was one of the kings of Babylon. He's mentioned in scripture. What do we know about him? Well, let's see if I find anything here. Evil Merodach was his name. Is he in here? Oh, there's lots of E words. Here he is. You notice right here. So we can look him up. Notice there's biblical references to his name mentioned here, which is good. So they're looking at scripture as well. And then sometimes you might have, there's not much known about him. So we just have a little bit about his name given from other resources. Okay, but again, helpful tool to consider. And as with epistles, this kind of information where we're looking up trying to identify the historical context, the social context, the geographical context, these things all provide information that give us insight that help us enter into the world of the author. They help us enter into the world of the audience to try as best as we can to understand. We can better understand what is said in the book as we better understand these features in the book that can help place us closer to the time in which it was written. All right. If you're reading a book and you don't know anything about the people in the book, you don't know anything about the places mentioned in the book, you're going to have a hard time understanding what's going on in that book. And so, especially when we talk about historical narrative, the geographical context is a very important part of that. Because usually in historical narratives, you're going to have lots of places mentioned, right? Because the author's just telling the story of events that took place in different places. It's important to understand something about those places. Then we can better understand what is going on. So for example, in John chapter 4, when Jesus enters into Samaria, well, what do we know about Samaria? Was that a big deal? Was it important? Or is that just, well, it turns out it's critical that we understand not only where Samaria is, but especially what the relationship that the Jews had with the Samaritans. You're not going to grasp the point of the story if you don't understand the history of Samaria and Israel. And so that's just one example of many where really we need to grasp, identify, understand as best we can, not only the people mentioned in the book, but the places mentioned in the book. All right. Can anyone think of maybe another example of that, of understanding a location and how in a particular biblical book and how that would be important to understanding the book or understanding the story, particular story? Anybody have another example that comes to your mind?
Well, the archaeological records that they have nowadays, and there is a lot on this. I watched a number of documentaries on the pharaohs of Egypt, and they have so much evidence. The only thing they missed was the breakdown of the religion of the priest of Karnak. And, for 80 years, that all broke down right after the Exodus. They didn't catch that, but they have a lot of things that I missed. But they know so much now about Egypt and the pharaohs and the archaeological evidence. Say nothing about, of course, the excavations in Jerusalem. They're constantly digging there. There's just so much that they know nowadays. I've got a big pile of archaeological magazines. I've canceled it now because it's getting so rank. But of course, you go on YouTube, there's some pretty good stuff on there if you look for it.
Yeah.
And boy, I tell you, that's exciting to see. They put some things together from what they know and they have evidence from that they've dug up. I find that very, enlightening.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's been a number of discoveries that have given more insight into different places people mentioned in Scripture. And of course, we know that, anything outside the Bible, there's the potential for mistakes or errors, but there is still a lot of helpful information that we can learn from different things. I'll mention to you later the Cyrus cylinder that was discovered. Very, very interesting what they found on this and how it compares to some things that we see in the Bible about Cyrus. There's been found various writings or inscriptions or statues or things that have certain things written on it that verify or demonstrate the authenticity of certain events that took place in the Bible. So it's really fascinating, interesting. You mentioned something, Dwayne, very important there about the Egypt. When you mentioned Egypt, the culture is another important element when we talk about context, as what do we know about the people of that time period? And what were their practices? What were their beliefs? That's an important feature of the background context as well. And this goes into what I just mentioned about Samaria. What do we know about the Samaritans? What do we know about the relation between the Jews and Samaritans? So those are important aspects. And when we talk about, like the pharaohs, as Dwayne just mentioned, what do we know about them? And so when we read in Exodus about Pharaoh and things that he said or did, understanding the culture and the background can be very helpful in giving us insights about that story. For example, many of the plagues that God brought upon the people of Egypt were directly connected to a particular deity in Egypt. So when he brought darkness on the land, right? This is Ra, the god of the sun. I can't remember deities there, but several of the deities that the Egyptians worshipped. There was a god of the Nile. There was a god of agriculture. They had particular gods over these things. So when the God, Yahweh, when he brought these plagues, he was actually demonstrating very specifically his power over each of these Egyptian deities. And so we may not recognize that just from what's in the scriptures. It may not give a lot of details about all of these different deities, but other archaeological finds and studies have identified these. And so that just helps enrich what's happening in the book of Exodus when we understand the culture and the beliefs of the people mentioned within the book, within the story. So this is why also not only do we want to understand the author, the audience, the social context, the historical context, the geographical context, but as I just mentioned, the cultural context as well. Again, what are the typical beliefs, practices, thinking of the people mentioned in the book. All right. And that goes into also if we can understand anything about the theological context as well. And then finally, what prompted the writing of the book? Now with epistles, this is generally easy to determine, or easier to determine. That is what situation took place, what events happened that caused the author to write the epistle. For narratives, that's a little bit more difficult because, again, often the author may not mention anything about why he decided to write a particular book. He just wrote it. And so there are often some clues. We're going to see that in the Gospel of John. We also, by careful study of the book, we can sometimes determine what may have prompted its writing, but not always. We don't always know what prompted the author to write, but we can find what the purpose of each book is. All right, so that's something to keep in mind. So our goal with the background context is to try to determine as best we can, or place ourselves as best we can into the world of the author and the audience. Again, what's the primary focus at the beginning of the study of a book of the Bible? It is to identify the author's intended meaning, what the author meant. So to do that, what helps is the more we can enter into the author's world, the better we will be able to understand what he is saying to his audience, to his hearers, to his readers. Okay, so background context. Again, pretty much we're looking for the same kinds of things as we did when we studied epistles, but it's just going to be a little more of a challenge when we're looking at narratives. But again, with narratives of particular importance is the historical background, geographical context of the book. All right. We're going to take a moment. In a moment here, we're going to look at an example from the Gospel of John on the background context. But before we do that, does anybody have any questions or thoughts, anything that comes to your mind from what we've just been talking about? Joshua, you have anything you'd like to add?
Nope. A bit.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just take an example from the Gospel of John, go through the background context of this book, and I think you'll find it to be helpful to do that. Many of us were familiar with the Gospel of John, and as we think about first, okay, can we identify who the author of the book is? Again, knowing who the author of a book is very helpful to identify a time period in which it was written, but also too to identify some of these other details about the recipients, the time period. That's going to be helpful. So if we can figure out who the author of a particular book is, that's going to be give us great insights. We naturally assume John was the author of the Gospel of John because it's called the Gospel of John. Well, of course he wrote it, right? Well, that title was added later. So we don't have these narrative books don't have titles that were given with the book typically. All right. But nowhere in the book does it indicate that John explicitly wrote it. In fact, his name isn't even in the book. There's John the Baptist. That John is mentioned in the Gospel of John, but John the disciple is not. It's kind of interesting. All the other disciples' names, or many of them, are in the book, but not John. But based upon our study of the book, we can determine that John the Apostle wrote it for two reasons. One, we call it the internal witness of the book. That is, what is inside of the book, what is in the book itself that might give us an indication of who wrote it. And then there's the external witness of the book. That is, there's information outside of the book, other resources, other books that can give indication of who the author is. Now, again, the internal witness, that is inerrant, right? Anything in the Bible we know is completely accurate. The external witness is, not inerrant, okay? But there are many helpful external resources. We just have to remember that any book you read that's not the Bible, there's the potential for errors and mistakes, especially historical works, okay? Because remember, historical books, what's the saying? History is written by the victors, and so oftentimes a historical book is going to be very biased towards those who are in power or the author who wrote it. For example, we read about, if you remember do you remember the story when the army of Assyria had gathered around Jerusalem? King Sennacherib. Does anybody remember that account? It's in Isaiah, I think 38. It's in 2 Kings. Can't remember, 35 or something, 34. No, before that. 30, 31, somewhere in there. But do you remember, right? Sennacherib, his army, Assyrians went through Judah and were defeating city after city, and they came and surrounded Jerusalem. And then the king sends this guy telling the people of Jerusalem, don't listen to King Hezekiah. We're going to defeat you. Our God's greater than your God. And Hezekiah goes to the temple and he cries out to the Lord. And then that very night, the angel of the Lord goes into the Assyrian camp and he kills 185,000 of the soldiers. Do you guys remember that story? It's a great story. Well, that event is actually described in the Assyrian Chronicles. But guess what they left out? They didn't mention the defeat. King Sennacherib didn't write about, how he lost a battle. He just said he had to go somewhere else to fight another battle. So if you read the Assyrian Chronicles, you're going to get a very different description of the events than you do from the scriptures. Why is that? Well, right, everyone's going to make themselves look good. So when they have the historians write their chronicles, they're going to leave out the bad parts and embellish or exaggerate the good ones. And so we just have to be careful when we are looking at resources outside of the Bible. They can be very, very helpful, but they're not always going to be 100% accurate. But again, they're a useful resource. So when we consider the author of the Gospel of John, we have clues within the book. We call that the internal witness. And then we have information outside of the book that is helpful. And that's called the external witness. Witness just means, right, testifying of something. All right. So let's take a look. What are the clues within the Gospel of John that might indicate who wrote the book? So let's turn our attention towards the end of the Gospel of John. Let's see how I want to do this. Okay. If you remember in John chapter 20, that's a description of the resurrection. And then John 21, let me just open that up. John 21, there's another story at the end of the gospel where Jesus manifested himself to the disciples at the Sea of Galilee. You guys remember this story, and they're fishing. Maybe why don't we just go ahead and read this. Tonging, can you read, say, verses 1 to 5? And then Fu Wei, I'm going to ask if you could read verses 6 through 11. Okay?
Read John 21, verse 1 to 5. After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he manifested himself in this way. Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee and 2 others of his disciples were gathered. Simon Peter said to them, I am going to fishing. They said to him, we will also come with you. They went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, children, you do not have any fish, do you? They answered him, no.
And, and he said to them, cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find a catch. So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, he is the Lord. So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have now catch. Simon Peter went out and drew the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn.
All right, so this gives us a description here of the events, right? They should sound very familiar, by the way, right? The disciples fishing all night. Notice it mentions 7 of them here. They were together, the Sea of Galilee, fishing. Didn't catch anything all night. Jesus shows up and tells them to throw the net on one side of the boat, and they did. And then all of a sudden, there's all these fish. Okay, does this remind you of any other time, similar event? Right, Luke chapter 5, early on in the ministry of Jesus, this exact same thing happened. And so, so this is an account being described. And then as we go further, so they have breakfast together, and then here's the famous account of Jesus and Peter, and the repetition, Simon, do you love me? And so that description, and Jesus telling Peter that, feed my sheep. And then he tells Peter that, that he's going, how he's going to die. And then, and here's where I want to focus our attention. As we get to verse 20, actually, we'll start, I'm going to have, let's see. Zali, could you read verses 18 to 20? And then John Cheng, I'm going to ask if you could read verses 21 to 24.
Verses 18 through 20.
Yes, thank you.
Truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will get you and bring you where you do not wish to go. Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, Follow me. Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, following them, the one who also had leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrayed you?
So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, and what about this man? Jesus said to him, If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Therefore this saying went out among the brethren, that that disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the word itself would not contain the books that would be written.
All right, thank you guys. So here we find some very interesting details regarding the author of the book, and even the author makes a little commentary at the very end. Notice he uses the first person there. Let's look back and consider this. Okay, what does the author reveal in John 21, verse 24? That was one of the last verses. He says, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and who wrote these things. So here in this verse, the author actually identifies himself, doesn't he? If we look at verse 24, he says, this is the disciple. Well, who is that disciple? Well, that's the one, remember, that Peter was asking the questions about. Remember, just a moment earlier, Peter, right, turning, he saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following him. And then he points to him and says, well, what about this guy? Who is that disciple? Let me actually go to the, it's easier to do this. Okay, so again, as Zali read, Peter saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, who this guy is mentioned throughout the book, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And Peter points to him and says, well, what about this guy? And Jesus said, don't worry about him. So there's that whole discussion there. But the important thing to note is the author then says, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things. Who is the disciple? The disciple whom Jesus loved. That is the author of the Gospel of John. All right. So if you do a careful reading of the book, when we get to the end of the book, we find out, oh, the author actually reveals who he is. He's one of the disciples, okay, because he's the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was the disciple who was at the Last Supper, who leaned on Jesus and asked who was going to be the betrayer. So we already now, okay, great. We've identified the author as one of the disciples. And we know it's not Judas. So we've narrowed our list to, there's 11 possibilities, right? Actually 10. We know it's not Peter either, because Peter's the one asking about the disciple whom Jesus loved. So, okay, we're down to 10 possibilities now, right? Of who the author of the book could be. And again, this is from the book itself. All right. So the author reveals himself as the disciple who's testifying and wrote these things. Who is that disciple? He's the one Peter was asking about, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Okay. And so we know, all right, so he's one of the disciples, not Judas, not Peter. Can we narrow that list down anymore? We can. If we go back to the very beginning of this chapter, who are the disciples who were present at this event in John 21? Notice verse 2. They're at the Sea of Galilee. There's Peter, there's Thomas, there's Nathaniel, there's the sons of Zebedee. Who are those guys? Anybody? Who's the son? Who are the sons of Zebedee?
John and James.
Yes, or the sons of thunder, they were called, John and James, and two other disciples that are not named here. They're not mentioned for whatever reason. So notice here, now we have the list of possibilities down to these seven: Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, James and John, and two others. Okay, and again, we know it's not Peter because he's the one asking the question about the disciple whom Jesus loved at the end of the chapter. So we're down to 6 possibilities now, right? You guys following me? There are 7 disciples named at the beginning who are in this story. And then at the end of the account, Peter points to the disciple whom Jesus loved and asks a question about him. And then the author says, the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's me. I'm the one writing to you. So he is one of these 6 people. All right. So we've narrowed the possibilities of the author of the Gospel of John down to one of these 6 guys: Thomas, Nathaniel, James, or John, or the 2 unnamed disciples. All right. So then we have to say, okay, now what would be the likely possibility? Again, here's the 7 disciples that of the 12 who were there, as I just mentioned. The 2 unnamed could be Philip and Andrew, since they are often with Peter. Andrew is Peter's brother, and we often see them together. If you remember back in John chapter 1, Andrew was there who saw Jesus, and he brought Peter. And if you remember Philip and Nathaniel, they were back at the very beginning, and they were also friends of Peter and Andrew. So it's very likely that these would be the guys who were, again, back fishing with their friends, Peter and James and John. We don't know for sure, though, but those are a good possibility as we think about who it could be. So these are the 7 mentioned. We have 5 of them mentioned by name. Then we have the 2 unnamed, which I believe could be Philip and Andrew. I think those are a very strong possibility. And then we notice that in verse 7, who is in the boat with Peter when Peter jumps out to swim to shore to see Jesus? The disciple whom Jesus loved. Now remember, John and Peter often were with each other, right? You remember who the 2 disciples were who ran to the tomb in John chapter 20?
Yeah, they were.
Yes, Peter and John.
And John.
Okay, so we do find them together at times. Keep that in mind. Okay, so as we think about this, the disciple whom Jesus loved was on the boat with Peter. So he's one of the 7 disciples described earlier. One of the, I should say 6, because Peter makes 7. Now, as we think about this, who could the disciple whom Jesus loved be? Who could that be? Well, it can't be Peter. We've already determined that, because he's the one who points to the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's the one who was with the disciple whom Jesus loved on the boat. It's not likely James, because James was martyred in the early church. All right, so he is not likely the one who wrote the book. James, remember, he's the brother of John, and he is one of the sons of Zebedee. Okay, he was a key apostle in the early church, but was killed as we read about in the book of Acts. In the Gospel of John, this fourth gospel is written much later. So it's likely it can't be him. Nathaniel and Thomas are also unlikely because they're named in John 21. And again, notice the author of this gospel only refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He never names himself. So that leaves us three possibilities. Okay, we've narrowed our list down to three. It could be John, one of the sons of Zebedee. And again, notice even in the story, he didn't name himself there. He just said John was one of the sons of Zebedee. It could be John or one of the two unnamed disciples. Okay, so we've got it down to three, right? The disciple whom Jesus loved is either John, the son of Zebedee, or one of the two unnamed disciples, which I think most likely, as I mentioned before, probably Andrew and Philip. Don't know for sure, but they're the most likely. They are the most probable. Now, who is most likely the disciple whom Jesus loved? That is the author of this book. All right, so we definitely have it down to three, just from what we find in the book itself. And at this point, I just want to stop and say that you guys, have you followed me so far? I mean, maybe you've studied this already and familiar with it, but this last chapter of John is very helpful in guiding us to who the author might be. And so have you been able to follow down to at least those three, John or the two unnamed disciples? It has to be one of those three guys. Any questions on that or disagreement? I'm happy to answer any. I think I haven't made any assumptions at this point, except for James. It couldn't be James just because we know he died very early in the early church. So he wasn't around when this book was written. But certainly it's not Peter. And as I mentioned, Thomas and Nathaniel are also not likely. It's down to those three, John or the two unnamed disciples. Who's the most likely among them? And I would say it is John, because for a few reasons. One, he's often the one closest to Peter. James and his brother John were the ones fishing all night with Peter the last time this miracle took place. And notice in chapter 21, he's with Peter again. Even in that discussion and conversation Jesus has with Peter, it is the disciple whom Jesus loved who was with John at that time. Thus, the internal witness indicates it's most likely John. And by the way, I believe John is the only disciple not specifically named in the book. I believe all the other disciples' names are given in the book. John never gives his own name. He just refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved or as the son of Zebedee. So again, I have to confirm this, but I believe that all the disciples' names are mentioned in the book of John, except for John. He refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, or son of Zebedee. Okay, so that could be very strong indication it is John, just from the book. We know for sure it's one of three disciples, and I believe based on what I just mentioned about John being close with Peter, and then also his name never being given explicitly in the gospel, that it is likely him. Now, that's the internal witness. The external witness confirms this. That is, resources outside of the Bible identified John as the author. And we don't have time to go through all the early church fathers and their descriptions of them, but let me just give you a summary of this, just again for your information. As Dwayne mentioned about the Egyptian pharaohs, you know, there's a lot of information that has been found about them. And in the same way, we have a lot of writings and information in the early church that can give us very helpful insights into some of these details, such as authors of the various books. So let me ask now if I could get maybe Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you read this quote here for us? This is from a man named Irenaeus, and he summarized the author of the four Gospels in the late 2nd century. Daniel, could you read what he said?
Yeah, I'll do that. The shaded part. Okay.
Yeah, the shaded
Yes.
part.
Right. Thank you. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in the book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia.
All right, thank you. Notice some very helpful information given here. This is again by Irenaeus, who lived in the late 100s. So this is about 150 years after the birth of the church. So it's, you know, a period of time, but it's not long after. And notice he mentions the four Gospels and gives us some details about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then finally John. Notice he identifies John from what we read in John 21, and he says John is the one who wrote the last gospel, and he actually says when he wrote it, as he does with Matthew. He says when Matthew wrote his gospel. Now, why is this significant? Well, one, it's when Irenaeus lived, but two, Irenaeus is a significant witness because he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So John, again, he had many men that he mentored. One of those men was a man named Polycarp. And Polycarp, he later mentored, discipled other men, one of who was Irenaeus. So you're looking at basically just the second generation after John, and he certainly, I'm sure, would have known. Polycarp would have certainly mentioned to Irenaeus, who wrote the Gospel of John. Right? I mean, if you were discipled by a writer of the Bible, wouldn't you tell other people about that? I think I would. So I think it is very, very likely that Irenaeus would have had, you know, at least secondhand information from Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So Irenaeus is a significant witness, and Irenaeus says that, this is a quote from him that Brother Daniel read. Irenaeus says that John was the author of that particular gospel, and identifies Matthew, Mark, and Luke as the authors of the other three gospels. Additionally, by the end of the 2nd century, John, if you look at many of the early church fathers, John was recognized almost by everybody as the author of the 4th gospel. Eusebius is a Christian historian who wrote about various events in the early church. He lived about 180 170, 60 years after Irenaeus. he affirmed the gospel writers of the New Testament, and John was considered given as the author of the Gospel of John. Okay, so what do we do all that for? What's the significance of that? Well, this example, a couple of things. One is we find just from a careful reading of the book itself, we were given a lot of information about who the author was. All right, we were able to, just from the book itself, identify one of three possibilities. And even from that, sort of identify John as the most likely, just from the book itself. And you'll find if you do a careful reading of most books in Scripture, there is often some indication that gives you clues about potentially who wrote the book, or at least when it was written. Luke's another example, where Luke doesn't give his name at the beginning of his gospel, but he gives clues in the book of Acts, which is the second book written by the same author of Luke, right? And in Acts, we find that the author uses the first person there. He says, I and me in several places, or we, as he's describing his travels with Paul in Acts. So we know that the author of the book of Acts was with Paul. And in the same way, as we look at the book itself and what is given in it in the book of Acts, we get many clues that direct us towards Luke as a writer. And I won't go through that here because it'll take a long time as well. But I just want to encourage you. This reminds us of the importance of being careful students of the word, and that we need to give effort as we read through a book. There's often much there that we don't realize. And as we go back, and this is why I encourage the first step where we do read through the book several times, make observations, get familiar with the book. That's going to help us, because then as we go through, we might notice as we've read through it several times, oh, here's something that the author says about himself, or here's a clue as to who the author would be, or here's some information that might help me know when the book was written. Okay, so just a reminder, as Paul said, be diligent in our study of the word. And that even means, in my opinion, just looking for these details that give us clues and insights into the background context of the book. Because again, the more we understand the background, the better that is going to help us understand what is written in the book. If I know that it's that the author is John, the author of this gospel is John, now I know, okay, this guy was with Jesus. Everything he writes about, he saw. And it indicates, it gives me a specific understanding of the particular events. He's a primary witness. And we know much about John through the other gospels, don't we? There's a lot of information about him. And that information can be helpful as we are reading what he wrote. Again, the more you know about an author, the better you're going to understand what he says. Because if you know about him and know his characteristics, that's going to help you better identify the things that he says and understand them, just like we talked about in the epistles. Okay. So yes, I know there's a lot of, that's a long exercise, maybe a little tedious as we go through all of those details, but this is what Bible study is, brothers. It's not casual reading. It's intensive, focused, spirit-dependent study. And the more we do that, the better we become familiar with the book. And I think that the better we will understand it, because the goal is trying to enter into the author's world. And if we know who the author is specifically, that really helps us in that process. Now we can't find the author of every book. All right. There are some books of the Bible that we just don't know. We don't know who wrote it. There's theories, opinions, possibilities. But many of the books of the Bible, we can identify who the author is, or at least the time period in which the book was written. For example, Chronicles, we talked about that. We aren't sure who the author is. There's some theories, but we do at least know the time period in which he wrote. And there are things the author says about himself or that gives us a little bit of insight into the type of person that he was. But notice here, and as you look at it, you do a study of author of the book, first try to ask yourself, okay, is there anything in the book that might give me a clue about the author, or potentially even who that author might be, or potentially when he wrote this book? And a careful study, I think, will reveal many times you'll get some information about that. And then we have the external witness. That is, there are resources outside of the Bible that might give us a clue or an indication as well, as we saw from Irenaeus. Very strong external witness. A sort of a grandson, in a way, a spiritual grandson of the Apostle John, and therefore one who we should give close attention to. As far as when he says who wrote that gospel, it's very likely an accurate assessment, and it confirms what we found from the book itself. Now, if Irenaeus had said that Peter wrote the Gospel of John, well, we would know that's not true, because the book itself would tell us differently. But Irenaeus only confirms what the book seems to direct us towards as who the author is. All right. I just want to show you an example of, giving a careful study or focus on the book itself can often give us many helpful clues. Maybe not about the author, but often about other parts of the background context as well. Comments about that? Sorry, I did most of the talking here tonight. But any comments or questions, insights, thoughts that come to your mind as we were going through this together?
Yeah, the church fathers are a tremendous source of insight. When I was at Shepherd Conference, I bought a bunch of stuff, devotional things that really critiqued those church fathers, the apostolic fathers, those early writers. And I'm thrilled with Athanasius, the man that championed, of course, the deity of Christ during the Arian controversy. And he's the first one that mentions all the books of the canon. And that was very early. And he also believed that Paul wrote Hebrews.
Yes.
And that's one of my favorite hobby horses. I am so convinced that Paul wrote it. It's plenty of internal evidence, just like what you did with John. You can do the same thing with that. Yes. And establish that. And well, anyway, there's a lot of the scholars, you got to be very careful. They don't do a lot of good scholarship in a lot of cases, but now you have the internet, you can check all this out yourself. But I'm here because when I went to Bible college, I was really doubting whether I had made the right decision. I had left a lot behind and it cost me a lot. And I went and read the church fathers, and that settled it. I never looked back since then. And so there's plenty out there if you just want to spend the time. And you've got the internet. Everything is at your fingertips. Oh, this business of Luther writing a German Bible. There was lots of German Bibles before him. In fact, very early, 400 years after Christ, there was a man, Eutychus, I think. It's hard to pronounce. I ain't got it right. I got to have it in front of me. But he actually created a alphabet and translated a Teutonic Bible. That was the first German dialects from northern India or northern Germany. And they still got remnants of that. It's extinct yet. They have it. And of course, the Waldenses, they translated all those dialects. And there was any number of German Bibles that he could have used as references besides the Latin that, of course, he used, and the Greek. But of course, I was born Lutheran, so I really am very much interested in Luther. You need to read Luther's The Bondage of the Will.
Yeah.
That guy knew what he was talking about. I don't know, Brother Tim, have you read that?
Yeah.
The Bondage of the Will by Luther. That says it beautifully. I've got a lot of Lutheran friends, and I always suggest they read that, but they haven't. And that thrills my heart, as he believed what I believe. And it's just Lutheranism doesn't reflect at all what he taught.
Yep.
And it's disgusting. But we have so much tradition. And of course, we as Baptists got that too. I don't know what you want to call yourself that doesn't have tradition, but we got to be careful about that. This Zoom period we've had really has showed me a lot of tradition that I've held to that's not, of course, necessary. And anyway, it's all very interesting, and we learn as we go along. But you got to get old enough. It takes time to get old, and you got to keep reading. As it's so interesting. I'm just thrilled to be alive at this time and see what I'm seeing. And I guess I actually have some hope of hearing the shout and the trumpet. I really am kind of excited about that.
It could happen.
I could possibly live that long.
Yeah.
If I don't, it's all right too. It's okay. But so interesting.
No, that's good point. With the early church fathers, there's a lot of, I mean, if you go to a library, you'll see just volumes and volumes of books that we have from the writings of the early church fathers, such as Irenaeus, and they give a lot of helpful insights into scripture, into the thinking of the church, just in the few hundred years after the birth of the church. And that there's a lot of helpful insights, some great preachers, John Chrysostom, Golden Mouth.
They carry weight. They really carry weight. I mean, they are heavyweights.
Yeah.
And
They lived
suffered.
in yes.
They
So
suffered for it.
there's a lot of really helpful information material. Like I said, just volumes. You'd be amazed how much actually we have from the early church fathers. They're called those in the leaders in the early church who had such an influence and were used by the Lord in great ways. So like Athanasius was one of those, really fought hard for the deity of Christ at a time when that doctrine was almost completely undermined by others. So he is a very important figure in the early church for us. Very good, thank you. Any other comments, thoughts, questions? I know
I'd like to see
go ahead.
Archaeology. We took my family, when we went home one time back 40 years ago, took a time over about 2 months. We landed in Egypt and just went freelance down the Nile with an open Jeep. And then we rode a bus over into Israel, rented a car, and looked at Lachish and looked at Hetzor, looked at Dan and all these places. And then we took the church in Singapore and we went on an archaeological tour in Jordan, in Syria, when we could. And then in Israel, that was, I think, over 2 weeks, almost 3. And we visited Gibeon, Gibeon, and it's just an empty field with a deep well. That's exactly like the Bible describes it. A big round tank, 30 feet across, goes down about 60 feet. And the jar handles that they found there establish the fact that it's Gibeon. And I'm going to tell you, it just, the things you see and can see. Now the trips you take now are just canned, I mean, they're really dry. They don't take you to any place at all. That's interesting. But there's so much to see. If you can get somebody to take you on an archaeological tour, and I could tell lots of stories, but we don't have time. It's already gone. But boy, is that nail things down.
Yeah.
That really puts body to the scripture and perspective as you take a look at these things actually. And there's just a few places where Jesus walked that you can see. Most of it is down anywhere from 30 to 60 feet in the rubble. Most of it is tradition and just simply shrines and paganism that you see nowadays. And hardly any of it take you to the museum in Jerusalem that's got absolutely amazing artifacts along with the Isaiah scroll. Have you seen that, Brother Tim? The Isaiah scroll in the book of the museum in the Museum of the Book in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I've seen pictures, but not the actual. I've seen
Well,
fragments of some of Qumran, but
You
yeah,
can go on the internet and see it now. But,
Yeah.
oh,
yeah, that's amazing. That's really, and they actually now have, there's a ministry called IBEX, which is a part of the Masters University.
Oh, I've seen that. That's where I
Yeah,
got most of my stuff.
They do like a 3-week tour of all those places, where the commercial tours won't take you, but they'll go places like Gibeon, the well, and things like that. It's very interesting. I haven't had a chance to do it. It's kind of expensive, but there's so much. And the worst job in Israel, I think, is being a contractor, because when they start digging, then they find this, ancient something, they have to stop. They're not allowed to keep going. So the government comes in and actually does an excavation project. So some guys, they may be wanting to build something and they'd have to wait 5 or 10 years sometimes, because they find oh, look, there's a Roman column here. So yeah, you don't want to be a contractor in Israel, because you'll never get anything done. But boy, archaeologists in Israel, there's a lot of neat stuff that's found there. So, and that just really encourages us and informs us, because when you actually see, oh, this is what the Pool of Siloam looked like, or Solomon's porch, or some of these things that have been discovered, really gives helpful insight into what we read in the scriptures. So that's, again, those digs, those artifacts, they're not inerrant, but they do help give us, support what we do see in the inerrant word, and give us tangible pictures of what we do read in the scriptures. So very interesting. But yeah, I haven't been to Israel for 20 years now, so I'd love to go back at some point. Maybe it's not going to be till the Messianic kingdom. I don't know, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll have to wait for the kingdom.
Yeah. So, but great. Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, we're almost at the end of our time here. I do have a couple of class notes to let you know about. I'm going to be in India the next 2 weeks, actually with Joshua. Both of us will be there. We have a regional conference with other missionaries who are in Asia. So I won't be able to have this class together for the next 2 Tuesdays, because I'll be gone at that. But plan to start again on June 21st of June will be our next time together. And actually, I'll be in the Philippines at that time. So just pray that I have good Wi-Fi, that we could have the class together. But that's my plan, Lord willing, is so we'll have 2 weeks off now. between them, since I won't be available, Joshua and I will be at the conference, but the 21st, we'll come back together and pick up where we left off. Okay, so I'm sorry about the delays and the gaps. Yeah, Tonkin, I'd love to come to Myanmar, so that might be a possibility later in the year. We'll have to just see as soon as things open up and it's okay to travel. Definitely want to visit you, brothers. So we'll see what the Lord has for that. But for now, we're going to just continue by Zoom and do the best we can with that. But so again, won't be meeting the next 2 weeks. We'll come back together on the 21st. Okay. Well, thanks for your time, brothers. Appreciate it. It's good to see you. I'll continue to pray for you all, especially for you brothers in Myanmar and just the really difficult challenges that you have right now. So with that, maybe I'll ask Pastor Philip, could you close us in prayer?